Hey Hazel, today we're talking about a really important topic for English learners, how to think in English.
Yes, Alex. Thinking in English is a crucial step if you want to be fluent. It might sound difficult at first, but it's totally achievable with practice.
I agree. I remember hearing a story about a guy named Miguel. He moved to an English-speaking country with minimal knowledge of the language. At first, he couldn't even order food properly. But with time, he started practicing daily, listening to English podcasts, and now he's fluent. The key was that he started internalizing the language and thinking in English.
That's an inspiring story. Miguel didn't just study English. He made it part of his daily life. He would label things around his house in English, and every time he saw something, he would use the English word in his mind. He even started talking to himself in English.
Exactly. He didn't just memorize words, he connected them to his everyday experiences. For example, instead of thinking "I'm hungry" in his native language, he would say it in English. Over time, his brain adapted to English.
Thinking in English helps you avoid translation, which can slow you down. When you translate from your native language to English, it takes extra time, and you might even make mistakes. But when you think in English, it becomes automatic.
Right, Hazel. It's like a new habit. You can start small with simple thoughts and then expand. Miguel, for instance, would start his day by thinking, "Now what should I wear today?" in English. Over time, he built momentum, and now he dreams in English.
And it's important not to worry about making mistakes. When you're learning to think in English, your brain is forming new connections. Mistakes are part of the process. Miguel made many mistakes at first, but he didn't let that stop him.
Exactly. And one more tip that helped Miguel was using visualization. If you see a chair, don't think of the word in your native language. Immediately say chair in English in your mind. This helped Miguel immerse himself in English.
That's a good strategy, Alex. And now Miguel can even express his emotions and complex ideas in English. That's the goal, to reach a point where you feel confident thinking in English.
Absolutely, Hazel. But let's break it down step by step for our listeners. The idea of thinking in English can feel overwhelming at first, especially if you're used to translating everything in your head. But like any new skill, it's all about practice.
Yes, exactly. So, if you're just starting out, don't try to think in full sentences right away. Start small. For instance, when you're getting dressed in the morning, label each item of clothing in your mind. Shirt, pants, socks. This might seem simple, but it's the foundation for building more complex thoughts.
That's a great tip, Hazel. And speaking of thinking in simple terms, let's say you're walking to the store. Instead of focusing on your native language, try to describe what you see around you in English. For example, there is a tree, or I am walking to the store. These are small steps, but they help you shift your internal language to English.
Right? And as you get more comfortable, you can start to add more detail. For instance, you can describe the tree. It's a tall tree with green leaves. This process helps train your brain to think in English instead of defaulting to your native language.
Exactly, Hazel. Another important thing is consistency. Miguel, from the story we mentioned earlier, didn't just practice once or twice. He made it a habit. Every day, he challenged himself to think more in English, even during simple tasks like cooking. He would mentally say the names of ingredients or think about the recipe in English.
And speaking of daily habits, listening to English audio content, like podcasts or audiobooks, is really helpful. When you hear English regularly, it helps you start to think in the language because your brain is getting used to it. Miguel listened to English podcasts every morning, which helped him think in English throughout the day.
That's true. Listening is crucial, especially when it comes to picking up new vocabulary and phrases. And here's another tip. When you learn a new word, try to use it as soon as possible. If you learn the word delicious, for example, think about something you ate recently and say to yourself, "That meal was delicious."
Yes, using new words right away is key to solidifying them in your memory. And it's okay to keep your thoughts simple at first. You don't need to construct long, complicated sentences when you're thinking in English. Just focus on getting the message across.
Definitely. And over time, your thoughts will naturally become more complex. Another thing that helped Miguel was writing down his thoughts in English. At the end of each day, he'd write a few sentences about his day in English, and this helped him reflect and organize his thoughts in the language.
Writing is a great exercise. It helps you slow down and really think about how to express yourself in English. Plus, when you write something down, you can look at it later and see where you've improved.
And don't forget about speaking, even if it's just to yourself. It might feel a bit strange, but talking to yourself in English is a powerful way to practice thinking in the language. Miguel would talk to himself while doing everyday tasks like cooking or cleaning, and this helped him build fluency.
Yes. It's like practicing a conversation, but without the pressure of someone else being there. You can ask yourself questions like, "What should I do today?" Or, "How do I feel right now?" And then answer them in English.
Exactly. And if you're worried about not having perfect grammar or pronunciation, that's totally normal. The key is to just keep going. Over time, the more you practice, the better you'll get.
And speaking of time, one thing to remember is that learning to think in English is a gradual process. It won't happen overnight, but with consistent effort, you'll start to notice small improvements. Miguel didn't become fluent in a week. It took months of daily practice.
Right, it's important to be patient with yourself. Don't get discouraged if it feels hard at first. Even Miguel struggled at the beginning. He made mistakes, but instead of getting frustrated, he learned from them and kept going.
Yes, mistakes are actually a good sign. They mean you're challenging yourself and learning, so don't be afraid to make them. If you find yourself translating in your head, try to catch it and switch to thinking in English. Over time, this will become more natural.
And speaking of translating, let's talk about another method Miguel used, immersing himself in English. He surrounded himself with the language as much as possible, not just with podcasts and audiobooks, but even by changing the language settings on his phone to English.
That's a really effective tip. By changing the settings on your phone or computer to English, you're forcing your brain to see and think in English all the time. And this constant exposure helps you stay in an English mindset throughout the day.
Absolutely. Another thing Miguel did was try to connect his emotions to English. For example, if he was happy, instead of thinking, "I'm happy" in his native language, he'd say it in English. It helped him relate to the language on a deeper, more personal level.
That's a good point, Alex. Emotions are a big part of how we think, so learning to express your feelings in English can make the language feel more natural. Whether you're happy, sad, or excited, try to think about those emotions in English. Now let's move on to the vocabulary section and break down some of the difficult words we used today. The first word we used was internalize. This means to make something a natural part of your thinking or behavior. For example, Miguel internalized English by practicing every day until it became natural for him to think in the language.
The next word is visualization. This is when you create a picture in your mind. Miguel used visualization by imagining the English words for everything he saw, which helped him immerse himself in the language.
Another word we used was immerse. To immerse yourself in something means to surround yourself with it completely. Miguel immersed himself in English by changing his environment to make it all about English.
The next word is achievable. This means something that can be done or accomplished. You can say, "Learning English is achievable if you practice consistently."
After that, we used minimal. This means very small or the least amount possible. Like, Miguel had minimal knowledge of English when he moved.
We also use the word adapted. This means to change or adjust to a new condition. For example, Miguel's brain adapted to thinking in English.
We talked about momentum too. This is when you gain energy or strength by continuing something. Once you start thinking in English, you build momentum.
The word connections was important. It means relationships or links between things. Your brain forms new connections when you practice thinking in English.
Now, Alex, let's go over some common questions learners might have about thinking in English. I'll ask, and you can answer. First question, how long does it take to start thinking in English?
Good question. It really depends on how much time and effort you put into it. Some people might start thinking in English within a few months of consistent practice, while for others, it could take longer. The key is to make it a daily habit.
What if I get stuck and can't think of a word in English?
That's totally normal. If you get stuck, try to think of a simpler word or phrase to express what you mean. And if you really can't think of anything, it's okay to look it up. But make sure you use it again soon so you remember it.
Should I stop translating completely?
It's better to minimize translation, but don't stress if you do it occasionally. Over time, as you practice thinking in English, the need to translate will naturally decrease.
Great. That wraps up our Q&A. Any final thoughts, Alex?
Just one. Don't rush the process. Learning to think in English takes time, but with patience and practice, you'll get there.
Well said. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Keep practicing, and soon enough you'll be thinking in English like a pro.
See you next time.